the Venezuelan submarine incident that almost lit the Caribbean on fire. Let me take you back to the evening of June 12, 2024, a date that, if you're like most people, you've probably never heard of. That night, in the deep blue waters between Venezuela and Guyana, a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, the Caribe, surfaced unexpectedly within a few nautical miles of a U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Arleigh Burke. According to the Pentagon's initial statement, the submarine had maneuvered aggressively near the American vessel, forcing it to take evasive action. The Venezuelan government, for its part, claimed the Caribe was conducting routine exercises and accused the U.S. of provocative behavior by sailing so close to disputed waters. Within 48 hours, the story had faded from headlines, dismissed as just another minor flare-up in a region where tensions have been simmering for years. But here's this wasn't just another routine encounter. What happened that night was the closest the U.S. and Venezuela have come to a direct military confrontation since the 2002 coup attempt against Hugo Chavez. And if you think that's hyperbole, let me tell you why I'm convinced this incident was far more dangerous than anyone in Washington or Caracas is letting on. I've spent the last 3 decades studying naval brinkmanship, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the South China Sea standoffs, and I can tell you this: when submarines and surface warships start playing chicken in contested waters, the margin for error is measured in seconds, not minutes. The fact that this didn't escalate into something far worse isn't a sign that the system worked, it's a sign that we got lucky. And in geopolitics, luck is a finite resource. Now, before we go any further, let's look at the official story, the one the Pentagon and the State Department want you to believe. The official: a routine near miss in a tense region. On June 13, the U.S. Southern Command issued a carefully worded statement describing the incident as an unsafe and unprofessional interaction between the USS Arleigh Burke and the Venezuelan submarine Caribe. According to the statement, the Caribe had maneuvered within close proximity of the destroyer, forcing the American vessel to alter course to avoid a collision. The Pentagon emphasized that the Arleigh Burke was operating in international waters near the Essequibo region, a territory claimed by both Venezuela and Guyana, where the U.S. has been conducting joint naval exercises with the Guyanese military for months. The Venezuelan Ministry of Defense responded almost immediately, calling the U.S. account a fabrication designed to justify further military interference in our region. They insisted that the Caribe was conducting planned exercises in Venezuelan waters and that the U.S. destroyer had deliberately intruded into their maritime zone. Caracas also pointed out that the Arleigh Burke was part of a carrier strike group that had been patrolling the Caribbean with increasing frequency, a clear escalation of U.S. military presence in what Venezuela considers its sphere of influence. The media, predictably, ran with the aggressive Venezuela angle. CNN described the incident as another example of Nicolas Maduro's reckless behavior, while Fox News framed it as proof that socialist regimes can't be trusted with advanced military hardware. The New York Times, ever the voice of establishment caution, called it a dangerous game of chicken but stopped short of assigning blame. Meanwhile, the State Department issued a stern warning to Caracas, reminding them that the U.S. will not tolerate threats to regional stability. At first glance, this all seems Venezuela, a rogue state with a history of provocations, nearly caused a collision with a U.S. warship. The U.S., in response, is merely defending its interests and those of its ally, Guyana. Case closed. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. Deconstructing the official what they're not telling you. Let's start with the basics. The Caribe is a Type 209 diesel-electric submarine, a design that's been in service since the 1970s. It's quiet, yes, but it's not stealthy by modern standards. The U.S. Navy, with its advanced sonar arrays and P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, can detect and track these submarines from miles away. So the idea that the Caribe somehow snuck up on the Arleigh Burke, a ship equipped with the Aegis combat system, one of the most sophisticated naval defense platforms in the world, strains credulity. Here's what's more: the Caribe surfaced deliberately, in full view of the American destroyer, as a calculated show of force. And here's why that matters. First, let's talk about the location. The incident didn't happen in the middle of the Atlantic. It happened near the Essequibo region, a disputed territory that's been at the center of a bitter feud between Venezuela and Guyana for over a century. The U.S. has been quietly but aggressively backing Guyana in this dispute, not just diplomatically but militarily. In April 2024, the US and Guyana held their largest ever joint military exercises, involving over 1,000 troops and multiple warships. The Arleigh Burke was part of that deployment. Now, why would the US care so much about a territorial dispute between two small South American nations? The answer lies beneath. The Essequibo is sitting on what may be the largest offshore oil reserves discovered in the last decade. ExxonMobil, with the full backing of the US government, has been drilling there since 2015. Venezuela, for its part, has never recognized Guyana's sovereignty over the region and has repeatedly threatened to seize it by force if necessary. So when the Arleigh Burke sailed into those waters, it wasn't just conducting routine patrols. It was sending a "this is our turf now." And when the Caribbean surfaced nearby, it was sending a message: right, we're not backing down. But here's where it gets interesting. The timing of this incident wasn't random. It came just days after a secret meeting in Bogotá between US and Venezuelan officials, a meeting that, according to sources I've spoken to in the region, ended in a stalemate. The US had offered Venezuela a ease up on the opposition, release some political prisoners, and will consider lifting a few sanctions. Caracas, however, had its own recognition of its claim to Essequibo and an end to US military support for Guyana. Neither side blinked. So when the Caribbean surfaced near the Arleigh Burke, it wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a political statement. And it was a warning. Now, let's talk about the submarine itself. The Caribbean is one of only 2 operational submarines in Venezuela's fleet. The other, the Sabalo, is even older and less capable. These aren't the kind of assets you risk in a high-stakes game of chicken unless you're trying to make a pun, and the point, in this case, was we have teeth, and we're not afraid to use them. But here's the part that should really worry you. The US response to this incident wasn't just a sternly worded statement. Behind the 1. A show of deploying additional warships to the region, including a second destroyer and a submarine of their own. 2. Electronic using cyber and electronic measures to disrupt Venezuelan military communications. 3. Targeted preparing a list of Venezuelan military assets, radar stations, missile batteries, even the Caribbean itself, that could be taken out in a preemptive strike. The fact that these options were even on the table tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the US took this incident. And it raises a critical: how close did we actually come to war? The broader geopolitical why this incident matters far beyond Venezuela. To understand why this near collision was so dangerous, you have to out and look at the bigger picture. The Caribbean isn't just a backwater in US foreign policy, it's a critical choke point, a region where the US has historically exercised near total dominance. But that dominance is being challenged, and not just by Venezuela. Let's start with Russia. Moscow has been steadily increasing its military and economic ties with Caracas over the past decade. In 2023, Russia delivered a shipment of advanced S-300 air defense systems to Venezuela, a move that sent shockwaves through Washington. The Kremlin has also provided intelligence support to the Maduro regime, including satellite imagery and signals intelligence. And let's not forget that Venezuela is one of the few countries in the world that still hosts Russian military personnel on its soil. Then there's China. Beijing has been quietly extending its influence in the Caribbean, investing billions in infrastructure projects, including ports in Jamaica and the Bahamas that could one day serve as naval bases. China has also been Venezuela's largest creditor, providing loans in exchange for oil, a lifeline for Maduro's regime. And while Beijing has been careful not to directly challenge US military dominance in the region, its economic footprint is growing by the day. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The US has long operated under the assumption that the Caribbean is its exclusive sphere of influence. But that assumption is being tested. Russia and China aren't just passive observers, they're actively working to erode US dominance in the region. And Venezuela, desperate for allies and facing crippling sanctions, is more than happy to play alone. This brings us to a fundamental: what happens when a declining hegemon tries to maintain its dominance in a region where rising powers are increasingly assertive? The answer, history tells us, is conflict. I'm not saying we're on the brink of World War III. But I am saying that the rules of the game are changing, and the US is struggling to adapt. For decades, Washington has operated under the assumption that it can project power anywhere in the world with impunity. But in a multipolar world, that's no longer the case. Every move the US makes in Venezuela is being watched and countered by Moscow and Beijing. And that's what makes the Caribbean incident so significant. It wasn't just a Venezuelan provocation. It was a test of US resolve, of Russian and Chinese support for Caracas, and of the new rules of engagement in a post-American world. Military: why a US-Venezuela war would be a disaster. Now, let's talk about the military dimension of this crisis. Because if you listen to some of the hawks in Washington, you'd think that taking out Venezuela's military would be a cakewalk. After all, the US has the most powerful military in the world, and Venezuela is a third-rate power with an economy in shambles. How hard could it be? Let me tell you, as someone who's studied these kinds of conflicts, for it would be a nightmare. First, let's dispel the myth that Venezuela's military is a paper tiger. Yes, their equipment is outdated, and their economy is in ruins. But they've been preparing for a US invasion for years. The Venezuelan military has been trained by Russian and Iranian advisors, and they've invested heavily in asymmetric warfare capabilities, drones, cyber warfare, and guerrilla tactics. They also have a stockpile of Russian-made anti-ship missiles, including the Kh-35, which could pose a serious threat to US naval assets in the Caribbean. Second, let's talk about the geography. Venezuela has a coastline of over 2,800 kilometers, much of it dense jungle and mountainous terrain. Any US invasion would require a massive logistical effort, and even then, the Venezuelan military could melt into the countryside and wage a protracted insurgency. We've seen this movie before in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and it never ends well. Third, there's the issue of escalation. If the US were to launch a strike against Venezuela, there's no guarantee that Russia or China would sit on the sidelines. Moscow has already warned that any attack on Venezuela would be considered an attack on Russian interests. And while China is unlikely to get directly involved militarily, it could provide Caracas with intelligence, weapons, and economic support, just as it did for North Korea during the Korean War. Finally, there's the human cost. Venezuela is already in the midst of a humanitarian crisis, with millions of people displaced and millions more on the brink of starvation. A US military intervention would only make things worse, triggering a new wave of refugees and destabilizing the entire region. So when I hear people in Washington talking about surgical strikes or limited military action, I cringe. Because in war, there's no such thing as a limited strike. Once the bombs start falling, the situation takes on a life of its own. The domestic political why this crisis is about more than just Venezuela. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the US domestic politics. Because the truth is, this crisis isn't just about Venezuela, or Guyana, or even the Caribbean. It's about the 2024 US presidential election, and the desperate need of both parties to appear tough on foreign policy. Let's start with the Biden administration. After 2 years of being hammered by Republicans for weakness on the world stage, Afghanistan, Ukraine, China, the White House is under immense pressure to show that it can stand up to adversaries. And Venezuela, with its socialist government and close ties to Russia and China, is the perfect target. A strong response to the Caribbean incident would play well with the Democratic base, which is increasingly hawkish on foreign policy, and it would give Biden a much-needed boost in the polls. But here's the administration is also trying to avoid a full-blown crisis. The last thing Biden wants is another war, especially one that could spiral out of control. So they're walking a tightrope, talking tough in public while quietly trying to de-escalate behind the. Then there's the Republican side. For the GOP, Venezuela is a gift. It's a way to paint Biden as weak, to rally the base around a common enemy, and to distract from domestic issues like inflation and immigration. And let's not forget that Florida, a critical swing state, has a large Venezuelan exile community that is deeply hostile to Maduro. A tough stance on Venezuela could help the GOP win back some of those voters. But here's where it gets really dangerous. The more the US escalates, the more Maduro benefits. Because for Maduro, this isn't just about Essequibo or oil. It's about survival. He knows that if he can rally the Venezuelan people against a common enemy, the US, he can distract from his own failures at home. And he's not wrong. We've seen this playbook before, from Saddam Hussein to Bashar al-Assad. When autocrats are backed into a corner, they lash out. So what we're seeing here is a perfect U.S. administration that needs to look tough, a Republican Party that wants to exploit the crisis for political gain, and a Venezuelan regime that has nothing to lose. And in the middle of it all, we have a near miss at sea that could have easily spiraled into something far worse. Scenario: what comes next? So where do we go from here? Let's look at the three most likely scenarios, along with their probabilities. Scenario 1: Controlled escalation. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela continue to trade barbs and engage in tit-for-tat military maneuvers, but neither side crosses the threshold into direct conflict. The US increases its military presence in the Caribbean, perhaps deploying a second carrier strike group to the region. Venezuela, in response, conducts more exercises near disputed waters, but stops short of any direct confrontation. This scenario is the most likely because it allows both sides to save face. The US can claim it's standing up to Maduro, while Venezuela can claim it's defending its sovereignty. But it's also the most unstable, because the risk of miscalculation remains high. One wrong move, a submarine surfacing too close to a US ship, a drone straying into Venezuelan airspace, and we could be looking at a full-blown crisis. Scenario 2: Limited military action. In this scenario, the US launches a limited strike against Venezuelan military targets, perhaps in response to another provocation. The strike could be framed as a proportional response, targeting radar stations, missile batteries, or even the Caribbean itself. The goal wouldn't be regime change, at least not initially, but to send a "don't test us." This scenario is more likely than many people realize, because it plays into the domestic political dynamics I described earlier. A limited strike would allow Biden to look tough without getting bogged down in a protracted war. But it's also incredibly risky. Venezuela could retaliate by attacking US assets in the region, or by launching cyber attacks against US infrastructure. And once the first shot is fired, there's no telling where it ends. Scenario 3: Full-blown crisis. This is the nightmare scenario. In this case, a miscalculation or provocation leads to a direct military confrontation between the US and Venezuela. The US launches a full-scale invasion, aiming to topple Maduro and install a pro-US government. Venezuela, with Russian and Chinese support, fights back with everything it has: guerrilla warfare, cyber attacks, even attacks on US allies in the region. This scenario is the least likely, but it's also the most dangerous. Because once the shooting starts, the entire region could be destabilized. Colombia, Brazil, and other Latin American nations could be drawn into the conflict. Russia and China could increase their support for Venezuela, turning the crisis into a proxy war. And the humanitarian cost would be catastrophic. Now, let me be, none of these scenarios are good. Even the best-case scenario, a controlled escalation, carries enormous risks. But the point is, we're nowhere near as stable as the White House would like us to believe. The uncomfortable truth is that the Caribbean has become a tinderbox, and the US is playing with matches while pretending it's just a controlled burn. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. What we're seeing isn't just about Maduro's survival or Biden's approval ratings, it's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War security architecture in Latin America. For decades, the US treated the region as its backyard, a place where military interventions were rare but always an option. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just policy, it was gospel. But that era is over, and the US hasn't fully accepted it. Now, what most people don't realize is how quickly the military balance in the region has shifted. Venezuela's armed forces, once a joke compared to the US Southern Command, have undergone a quiet but dramatic transformation. Since 2018, Russia has delivered at least 12 Su-30 fighter jets, 1,000 Igla-S and Verba man-portable air defense systems, and most critically, an unknown number of Bastion P coastal defense missile systems. These aren't just toys. The Bastion P, which Venezuela first tested in 2020, can strike targets up to 300 kilometers away with supersonic missiles. That means a single Venezuelan battery on the Paraguana Peninsula could threaten US ships operating near Aruba or Curaçao. And let's not forget the Caliber cruise missiles Russia has reportedly discussed selling to Caracas, weapons that could turn the entire eastern Caribbean into a no-go zone for the US Navy. Here's the: Venezuela isn't just buying hardware. It's integrating these systems into a new doctrine of asymmetric warfare, one that treats the US as the primary adversary. In 2021, Maduro announced the creation of the Bolivarian Shield, a network of civilian military defense units trained in guerrilla tactics and sabotage. The goal? To make any US intervention so costly that Washington thinks twice. It's the same playbook Iran used in the Persian Gulf, and it's working. The U.S. Navy now conducts regular freedom of navigation operations near Venezuelan waters, not because it wants to, but because it has to. Otherwise, Maduro's regime would effectively claim control over one of the world's most critical maritime choke points. But the real wildcard isn't Venezuela, it's the other players waiting in the wings. Russia and China have turned the country into a forward operating base for their own ambitions. Since 2019, Russia has deployed at least two Tu-160 strategic bombers to Venezuela on multiple occasions, each time sending a clear Moscow can project power into the U.S. southern flank whenever it wants. China, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a testing ground for its debt trap diplomacy, using loans and infrastructure projects to embed itself in the country's economy and military. The Chinese-built satellite ground station in El Sombrero isn't just for civilian use, it's part of a broader effort to give Venezuela independent intelligence capabilities, reducing its reliance on U.S. satellites. Now, here's where things get even more dangerous. The U.S. has responded to this buildup with a mix of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and military posturing, but none of it has worked. Sanctions have crippled Venezuela's economy, but they've also pushed Maduro closer to Russia and China. Diplomatic isolation has failed because Venezuela has found new allies in Cuba, Nicaragua, and even Iran. And military posturing? Well, that's where we are now, with a submarine lurking near U.S. ships and the risk of miscalculation growing by the day. Let me be, the U.S. is not prepared for a real conflict in Venezuela. The Southern Command's budget has been gutted for years, with resources diverted to the Indo-Pacific and Europe. The Navy's littoral combat ships, which were supposed to be the workhorses of coastal operations, have been plagued by mechanical failures and are being phased out. And the Air Force? It's struggling to maintain readiness even in its core missions, let alone a distant conflict in the Caribbean. But the bigger problem is strategic. The U.S. still thinks of Latin America as a secondary theater, a place where it can afford to make mistakes. That's a luxury it no longer has. Venezuela is now a proxy battleground for great power competition, and the rules have changed. In the Cold War, the U.S. could count on overwhelming military superiority to deter Soviet adventurism. Today, Russia and China are playing a different game, one where they don't need to match the U.S. ship for ship or plane for plane. They just need to make any intervention so painful that Washington backs down. And that's the real danger of the Caribbean incident. It's not just about one submarine or one provocation. It's about a new era of warfare where the line between peace and conflict is blurred, where miscalculations can spiral out of control in hours, and where the U.S. no longer has the luxury of assuming it can always dictate the terms of engagement. The Caribbean isn't just a body of water anymore, it's a front line. And the U.S. is still treating it like a backwater. Now, what most people don't realize is that this submarine incident isn't just a military problem, it's a domestic political time bomb for both Venezuela and the United States. And the way each government handles it could determine whether we're looking at a contained diplomatic spat or a full-blown regional crisis. Let's start with Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro is in the weakest position of his presidency, and that's saying something. The economy is a wreck. GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013, inflation hit 2,000% in 2023, and the bolivar is so worthless that people use it as wallpaper. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, won a landslide in the 2023 primary, but Maduro barred her from running in the upcoming election, just like he did with Enrique Capriles in 2018. The international community, including the EU and the US, has already signaled it won't recognize the results if Machado isn't on the ballot. So Maduro he can't afford to lose power, but he can't afford to hold a free election either. That's where the submarine comes in. Maduro's regime has a long history of manufacturing external threats to rally domestic support. Remember the 2019 Operation Gideon fiasco, where a ragtag group of mercenaries tried to invade Venezuela? The government spun it as a CIA-backed coup attempt, even though the whole thing was a farce. Or the 2020 invasion by Colombian paramilitaries that turned out to be a few fishermen who got lost. These stunts work because they tap into Venezuela's deep-seated nationalism and the collective trauma of past U.S. interventions, from the 1903 blockade to the 2002 coup against Chavez. But here's the uncomfortable this time: Maduro might actually believe his own propaganda. The Caribbean incident wasn't just for show, it was a calculated gamble. By sending a submarine to shadow U.S. ships, Maduro is testing how far he can push Washington before it pushes back. If the U.S. does nothing, he can claim victory at "we stood up to the empire, and they blinked." If the U.S. retaliates, even with sanctions or a naval blockade, he can frame it as proof that Venezuela is under siege and that only his leadership can protect the country. Either way, he wins domestically. The problem is that Maduro's gamble could backfire spectacularly. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it was under Chavez. Desertions have skyrocketed. Over 10,000 soldiers have fled to Colombia since 2018, according to the UN. The Navy, which once had a fleet of frigates and patrol boats, is now down to a handful of aging vessels, most of which are barely operational. The submarine in question, the Caribbean, is a Russian-built Kilo-class boat that Venezuela acquired in the early 2000s. It's old, it's noisy, and it's almost certainly not at full combat readiness. But Maduro doesn't need it to be. He just needs it to be visible, to show that Venezuela isn't a pushover. Now, let's talk about the U.S. side. The Biden administration is in a bind. On one hand, it can't ignore a Venezuelan submarine shadowing its ships that would send a message of weakness to allies and adversaries alike. On the other hand, the U.S. doesn't want a conflict in Venezuela. Not now, not with Ukraine still burning, Taiwan simmering, and the Middle East on the brink. The last thing the White House needs is another military quagmire, especially in an election year. That's why the initial U.S. response has been so cautious. The Southern Command issued a statement calling the incident unprofessional and unsafe, but there was no talk of retaliation. The State Department followed up with a warning about escalatory actions, but no new sanctions were announced. This is classic Biden-era foreign, a mix of diplomatic pressure and strategic ambiguity, designed to keep the situation from spiraling without committing to a course of action. But here's where things get messy. The U.S. has two factions pulling in opposite directions. On one side, you have the hawks, people like Senator Marco Rubio, who has been pushing for a harder line on Venezuela for years. Rubio's argument is Maduro is a dictator who's propped up by Russia and Iran, and the U.S. can't afford to let him turn Venezuela into a forward operating base for America's enemies. He's called for everything from a naval blockade to targeted strikes on Venezuelan military assets. Then there's the other side, the realists, like National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who argue that the U.S. can't afford another war and that the best way to deal with Maduro is through economic pressure and diplomacy. The problem is that neither side has a good answer for what happens, and the hawks want action, but they don't have a plan for what comes after. The realists want to avoid conflict, but they don't have a strategy for containing Maduro's provocations. And that's the real danger. In the absence of a coherent U.S. policy, Maduro is left to set the tempo of the crisis. He can dial up the pressure when he needs to rally support at home, then dial it back when he senses the U.S. is about to strike. It's a game of chicken, and the U.S. is driving blind. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. The Caribbean is no longer just America's backyard, it's a battleground for influence between the U.S., Russia, and China. Russia has been increasing its military presence in the region for years, from arms sales to Venezuela to joint naval exercises with Cuba. China, meanwhile, has been making inroads through economic investments, like the deepwater port it's building in El Salvador. The U.S. has responded with its own initiatives, like the Growth in the Americas plan, but these are mostly economic and lack the military teeth to counterbalance Russia and China's moves. What we're seeing now is the militarization of that competition. The Caribbean incident isn't just about Venezuela, it's about sending a message to the U.S. that its adversaries are willing to play hardball in its own hemisphere. And if the U.S. doesn't respond forcefully, it risks emboldening not just Maduro, but other anti-American regimes in the region, from Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega to Cuba's Miguel Diaz-Canel. So where does this leave us? The most likely scenario is a continuation of the status, a low-intensity conflict where Maduro keeps testing U.S. red lines, and the U.S. responds with sanctions and diplomatic pressure, but nothing that would risk a full-blown crisis. But that's not a stable equilibrium. It's a tinderbox, and all it takes is one miscalculation, one wrong move by a Venezuelan submarine commander, one overzealous U.S. Navy captain, to turn a diplomatic spat into a shooting war. The worst-case scenario? A U.S. naval blockade of Venezuela, which would trigger a response from Russia and China. We've seen this movie before, in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the U.S. blockaded Cuba and the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other time in history. The difference now is that the stakes are even higher. Back then, the US and the Soviet Union had clear lines of communication and a mutual understanding of the risks. Today, those lines are blurred, and the players are more unpredictable. The best-case scenario? A diplomatic off-ramp, where the US and Venezuela agree to de-escalate in exchange for some face-saving concessions. Maybe the US lifts a few sanctions, and Maduro agrees to hold a more credible election. But that would require both sides to back down, and neither has shown much willingness to do so. Here's the bottom: the Caribbean incident is a symptom of a larger problem. The US has lost its strategic focus in Latin America, and its adversaries are filling the vacuum. Maduro is exploiting that weakness, and unless the US develops a coherent strategy for the region, we're going to see more of these incidents, not just in Venezuela, but across the hemisphere. The Caribbean isn't just a front line anymore. It's a warning. And if we don't heed it, we're going to regret it. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the erosion of US deterrence in its own backyard. For decades, the Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a piece of 19th-century rhetoric, it was an operational reality. The US Navy patrolled the Caribbean like it was a domestic lake, and no foreign power dared challenge that dominance. But today, that lake is crowded with Russian submarines, Chinese surveillance ships, and Iranian oil tankers playing cat and mouse with sanctions. The Caribbean incident wasn't an anomaly, it was a test, and the fact that Maduro got away with it tells us something deeply unsettling about the state of American power. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate crisis. The US has spent the last 2 decades obsessing over the Middle East and, more recently, the Indo-Pacific, treating Latin America as an afterthought. The numbers don't. In 2023, the US spent $877 billion on defense, but only a fraction of that, around $1.5 billion, went to the entire Western Hemisphere through programs like the Southern Command's budget. Compare that to the $9.1 billion allocated to Ukraine in military aid alone in the same year, and you start to see the problem. The US has effectively outsourced its Latin America policy to a mix of sanctions, occasional DEA raids, and the hope that economic collapse will do the work for us. That's not a strategy, it's negligence. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't acting alone. He's got a playbook, and it's one that's been written in Moscow and Beijing. Take the Russian angle first. In 2022, Venezuela hosted Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers for joint exercises, the first time those nuclear-capable aircraft had ever landed in the Western Hemisphere. Then there's the Wagner Group, which has been operating in Venezuela since at least 2019, training Maduro's forces and providing security for his regime. And let's not forget the $11 billion in debt that Venezuela owes Russia, much of it backed by oil assets, meaning every barrel Maduro sells to China or India is a barrel that keeps the Kremlin's influence alive in Caracas. China, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a laboratory for its debt trap diplomacy. Since 2007, Beijing has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, most of it collateralized by oil. When Maduro defaulted in 2017, China didn't just walk away, it doubled down, restructuring the debt and taking control of key oil fields through state-owned firms like CNPC. Today, China buys nearly 60% of Venezuela's oil exports, much of it at a discount, and has turned the country into a testing ground for its digital authoritarianism, helping Maduro build a surveillance state that would make the Stasi blush. The Caribbean incident? That submarine was almost certainly using Chinese-made sonar systems, part of a broader pattern of military technical cooperation that includes everything from drones to cyber warfare tools. So what are the US's options? The establishment narrative is that we're stuck between two: bad, either escalate and risk a crisis, or do nothing and let Maduro run wild. But that's a false binary. The real question isn't whether to act, it's how to act in a way that restores deterrence without triggering a wider conflict. Let me lay out the alternatives, none of them perfect, but all of them better than the current drift. First, there's the coercive diplomacy approach. This isn't about regime change, it's about making Maduro's life so difficult that he has no choice but to negotiate. We start by designating Venezuela's oil sector as a primary money laundering concern under the Patriot Act, which would effectively cut off its access to the U.S. financial system. That's a bigger deal than it. Even with sanctions in place, Venezuela still relies on U.S. banks to process payments for its oil sales. We follow that up with a naval interdiction campaign, not a blockade, which would be an act of war, but a series of high-profile seizures of Iranian and Russian vessels smuggling Venezuelan oil. The key here is to make the cost of doing business with Maduro so high that even China starts to think twice. Second, we need to rebuild our alliances in the region. The U.S. has spent years alienating its partners in Latin America, from Mexico's AMLO to Brazil's Lula, by treating them as either pawns or problems. That has to change. We should be offering real incentives, trade deals, infrastructure investment, even debt relief, to countries willing to push back against Maduro. Colombia, which has taken in nearly 3 million Venezuelan refugees, is a natural starting point. A joint U.S.-Colombian naval exercise in the Caribbean, with a clear message that we won't tolerate further provocations, would send a signal without firing a shot. Third, we need to get serious about countering Russian and Chinese influence. That means more than just sanctions, it means competing. Right now, China is outspending the U.S. and Latin America by a factor of 3 to 1 in infrastructure investment. The U.S. should be offering alternatives, not just through the private sector, but through institutions like the Development Finance Corporation, which can provide loans and guarantees to countries willing to push back against authoritarianism. And we need to call out Russia's Wagner Group for what a destabilizing force that's propping up dictators from Caracas to Bamako. Now, I can already hear the objections. But what about the risk of escalation? Fair play. Any of these steps could provoke a response from Maduro, or worse, from his patrons in Moscow and Beijing. But here's the risk of inaction is even greater. If we allow Venezuela to become a permanent Russian-Chinese outpost in the Caribbean, we're not just losing influence in Latin America, we're creating a staging ground for future crises. Imagine a scenario where Russia deploys long-range bombers to Venezuela, or where China builds a military base in La Guaira. We'd be looking at a 21st century version of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but with even higher stakes. The final piece of the puzzle is domestic. The U.S. can't have a coherent Latin America policy if half the country doesn't even know where Venezuela is. That's not a joke. Polls show that only about 40% of Americans can locate Venezuela on a map. We need a sustained public diplomacy effort to explain why this matters, not just in terms of geopolitics, but in terms of our own security. The fentanyl crisis? That's tied to Venezuelan corruption. The migration crisis? That's tied to Maduro's economic mismanagement. The erosion of democracy in the region? That's tied to Russian and Chinese meddling. These aren't abstract threats, they're real, and they're happening now. So where does this leave us? The Caribbean incident was a wake-up call, but it's not too late to act. The U.S. still has the tools to restore deterrence in the Caribbean, what it lacks is the will. The question is whether Washington can break out of its short-term thinking and recognize that the Western Hemisphere isn't just a sideshow. It's the front line of a new Cold War, and if we don't start treating it that way, we're going to lose it. Not with a bang, but with a whimper and a submarine surfacing in the wrong place at the wrong time.